Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'd like to say a special thank you to the sponsors as well, because without them we wouldn't be here. Thank you. So you can see my first slide summarises everything, so if you're still a bit sleepy, just nod off, okay? All right, dualities of interest are listed there. All right. Instead of an overview, I've got some questions for you to think about during the presentation, and I'll define those properties as we go along, words like hominins and frugivory, and how we modelled macronutrient intake, and the final sums about total sugars intake. All right, so we do have a unique phenotype. The first thing that I want you to note is that our brain is about 6 to 7 times higher in weight, in volume, than you'd expect for our body weight. That's on a usual linear scale. Chimps and primates in general have a higher brain weight, but we're the biggest. We have a smaller gut at the same time, which seems like a paradox. A jaw that's smaller, teeth and face that are flatter and smaller. If you think of a dog and a carnivore and animals that chew a lot of food, it's much bigger. We have a very, very prolonged childhood compared to other apes, and high reproductive output compared to other apes. And that's because we wean our infants earlier than they do. A gorilla mother feeds for 7 years, the poor things. So we have to consider that we're different for good reasons, and perhaps all of them are connected by our dietary needs. So something else for you to think about during the presentation is what drove this bigger and bigger brain. What drove it? And the evolutionary biologists are all in agreement that diet had a lot to do with it. Accessing that diet, getting the energy and extracting the energy from foods. So evidence, objective evidence of a bigger brain is really a no-brainer. But it's not just the volume and the weight, it's also, excuse me, the size of the carotid canal, and the diameter of that can be measured in various fossils. And this was done by an Australian group. And the writing's a little bit small, but I just want to show you that this little animal down the bottom is Australopithecus afarensis, which is better known to you as Lucy, who is about 1 metre tall. And then along the curve, you've got Homo habilis, also known as handyman, because he was using tools. Early and late Homo erectus, and in fact they survived for 2 million years. They're actually really successful hominins, very successful. If you compare it, we here, Homo sapiens at the top, have only survived for the last 300,000 years. And at one time, there were 36 species of Homo at the top, and we are the only ones so far to survive, and we probably haven't got long as it stands. Oh. All right, so the metabolic cost of a large brain is a major consideration. All brains, all primate brains, use 5 milligrams per minute per 100 grams of glucose. It runs on glucose, just like the car runs on petrol, fuel, gas, whatever you want to call it. And so because it's on a per 100 gram basis, you can see that chimp brains would use much less than our brain, which is about 1.4, 1.5. There were actually Homo that had bigger brains than us, weightier brains. Neanderthal was bigger. And another one, the Denisovans, were bigger. And there's one that's really exceptionally big that they've discovered in China that they're calling Dragon Man. And maybe they just got too big. Anyway, there's a lady called Susanna Herculo Husel, who's now in Berkeley, but she comes from South America. She is shaking up this field because she's showing actually that our brain is not that special. It's not remarkable really in its anatomy or anything else. It's just a scaled up primate brain that's exorbitantly expensive to run. Okay, you can watch her lectures on YouTube. So the energy cost of an adult brain is at the crux of what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to dwell a little bit on the fact that it occupies only 2% of our body weight, but 20% of our resting metabolic rate. Okay, now, excuse me, that's nothing compared to the next slide. Cost of a child's brain at the obesity nadir, which is about 5 years, occupies about 10% of their body weight proportionally, but uses 66% of their basal metabolic rate. Very few people are aware of this fact, but it comes from very good studies, MRI studies, where they've measured the oxygen and glucose uptake. Now, because it's early in the day, I'm doing the maths for you. Their BMR is about 1,000 calories a day. It comes out at about 165 grams of glucose a day. Now, is it any surprise that they have a sweet tooth? Okay, all right. It's not the only thing that's using glucose. It's not just the brain. The red cells use glucose exclusively. The kidney medulla, the fetus uses glucose almost exclusively, and the placenta uses just as much. Okay? So I'm doing the sums here on this slide. You can see that if you add the brain needs, the kidneys, and the red cells, it comes to about 160 grams per day in adults. But some adults are reproductive, and even though it's only a small phase of life, it produces the next generation of human beings. So they are absolutely critical to survival of the species. All right? Not to mention the economy. So 70 grams a day for the placenta and the fetus in total, 70 grams for milk production. And so at least in a reproductive female, they need 230 grams of glucose. Now, I haven't even suggested that they're exercising, that they might be exercising at something like 75% VO2 max, which requires glucose for the muscles. So that's on top of these sums. So, next question, what did early hominins eat? And by early, I mean 4 to 1 million years ago, because our last common ancestor with chimpanzees is thought to be 6 to 7 million years ago. They're thought to be frugivores. Hominins means apes, large apes, including us. Apes don't have a tail, monkeys do. We know much about their diet, but not everything. We can only speculate. We can determine objective signs of diet from habitats, climate, things like isotopes like C13 and C12 in teeth and bones. Looking at teeth morphology tells you a lot about diet. Looking at dental caries in teeth, fossil teeth, tells you about diet. But much later, hearths, where we surround ourselves in a family group around a campfire, grinding stones that are left behind, and finally genes. Mutations to do with metabolism, copy number variations, CNVs, like AMY1, and the shared ancestry with chimpanzees, our closest relative, living relative. So now we move on to frugivory. And frugivory is defined as an animal that consumes at least 60% of its energy as fruit. And chimps are ripe fruit specialists. By ripe fruit, they needed colour vision. So primates have colour vision. The people that think that we're carnivores by nature, well, they might like to know that carnivores do not need colour vision because their predators, their animals that they eat are not coloured. The ripest fruit are highest in energy and a whole lot of other things as well, including vitamin C and all the colours, the luteins, the flavonoids, the anthocyanins that come with glucose, because glucose, sucrose and fructose need antioxidants, and in the fruit they're there automatically. So we think that frugivore itself, that behaviour, may have driven brain growth because it requires all this elaborate cognition. For example, remembering where the ripest fruit will be for hundreds of species that are in the forest. When does it ripen? So they can go all year eating the ripest fruit as long as they remember where that ripe fruit will be in the forest. And they plan to compete with other sources, other animals that want ripe fruit as well. So this is the paper by Alexandra de Cassian that started me on this whole business of what did early hominins eat. So she showed that frugivore was associated with bigger brains. No. Now, at the time, the sociality hypothesis, which was the hypothesis that we got big brains because we needed them in bigger groups of people, we had to compete with each other, we needed elaborate, complex cognition to the politics of living in a big group required a bigger brain. But actually, at least in this 140 species of primates, there was no evidence of that whatsoever. Sociality, the number in the group, did not predict it. Okay, so how did we model hominin diets? Well, we started with what we knew. We knew what chimps eat, and a lot of this is because they live in zoos and research stations, and people like David Raubenheimer have studied them very closely. David is one of my colleagues at the University of Sydney. He's responsible for the nutritional geometric framework that's being used at the moment in nutrition. All right, so the macronutrients in a chimp diet, they eat about 2,500 calories a day. 3/4 of it is carbohydrate, but sometimes it's 95% carbohydrate. It's relatively low in proteins. Humans have relatively low protein requirements compared to other primates and other apes. And we're amazingly consistent. We really, we're not fond of eating extremely high protein diets. We have to make an effort to do that. But we do prioritise protein so that we get that target of 15% every day. And we're very strategic, or at least the chimps are very strategic about where they get their food, so their nutrients from. So they eat fruit for breakfast and dinner, and they eat leaves for lunch. And the girls, the mothers with babies, are actually, they're up at 4 a.m. and they've built a nest the night before so that they can be up at 4 a.m. and in the dark they find the ripest fruit on the tree before their competitors. So the trouble was that over the next 3 million years we had global cooling, which means less plant growth. It means less rainfall, and this means less fruit and more grasslands and more grazing animals on those grasslands. So we know there was an increase over this time in the percentage of animal foods because we can look at this ratio of the 2 carbon isotopes in teeth and other fossilized bones. So we know that eventually, relatively late in human evolution, we had the control of fire. Perhaps we cooked things a bit earlier than that. Maybe just we took advantage of a wildfire here and there, and we found that the starchy tubers had been cooked and they were quite nice to eat. But before that, we did not like starch. We did not eat raw starch. Even pigs today will not eat raw starch. Okay. So, what do modern foragers eat? 11 climate foragers in this group. This is Dan Lieberman at Harvard, and you can see that they are producing very nice data here, just on the warm climate ones, because that's where we evolved in a warm climate. We did not evolve in Antarctica. So you can see there, they measured total sugars intake. It averaged 17% of energy. It included honey, quite large amounts of honey in some cases. And there were some groups that ate no meat, some ate little plant foods. So there's no such thing as a paleo diet, okay? So, modelling diet composition. Let's start with the chimp diet, end with the modern forager diet. Assume there's increases in brain and body weight. Assume that the percentage animal food increases from 5% to 35%, that carbohydrate declines because animal foods don't contain carbohydrate of any importance, but we should incorporate the fact that starches begin to increase with cooking and the starches to sugar ratio increases. Leave the protein target at 15% and generate the macronutrients. And I just want you to concentrate here on the sugars percentage. In chimp diets, it's 66%. 66% of energy. And when David did his simian diet, he showed that it was 60% sugars. And you can see by the time we get to Homo sapiens at 1500, you can see there that it's 26%. But it was a third of calories for most of human evolution. But notice the fibre content. The fibre, the proportions of fibre to carbohydrate were huge. And I think we should be looking at that as the basis for how we estimate the amount of fibre that's needed today. But look at carbohydrate balance. Carbohydrate balance is the difference between what's available in the diet and what the obligatory demand for glucose is, as calculated in the earlier slide. And you can see there it's very positive across evolution, across increasing brain size. And that was adults. This is reproductive females. And remember, we depend on them for the survival of the species. You can see carbohydrate balance is getting more and more precarious, if you like. The positive side of things is not so positive as it is in males that are not reproducing in any significant way. And then if you look at carbohydrate balance in the absence of carbohydrate, in reproductive females who are depending entirely on gluconeogenesis. And now, I have to tell you that I'm not sure what females do in terms of gluconeogenesis. We know it's upregulated. In males, we know exactly what it is because they've been measured, okay? And that was by Marguerite Westerter. But you can see there it becomes negative. In other words, we cannot reproduce on a low carbohydrate diet. So, summarising, sweet humans have a large brain fueled by glucose. Fruit and honey met the demand in early hominins. Modelling shows at least a quarter of the calories came from sugars. And incidentally, that's about how much we get from sugars today, if you include both added and naturally occurring. Starch comes later. Whole grains come later, not until we could cook. And at times, carbohydrate may have been limiting. So finally, a thought for something that came up yesterday with our Chinese colleague, Professor Yu Song, and you can see that we today have no recommendation about the minimum carbohydrate content of a diet, and yet the survival of our species depends on it. And so finally, I want to just acknowledge my co-authors, Karen Hardy, Les Copeland and David Raubenheimer. Thank you.